Good morning.
Good morning, Louise.
How are you?
How are you? I'm okay. What about you?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Good. Okay. So I'll start talking to everyone in Portuguese, right, Louise? And then I'll speak in English, right? So you're gonna be with us all the time.
Okay, so I have one question with regard to the PowerPoint. Do you manipulate it or do I? Do you move the slides or do I? That's
The students are going to do that for us.
What's that?
The students are going to do that for us.
Okay, so I have to tell them, move to the next slide, move to the next slide, etc.
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right then. So, bom dia a todos. Muito feliz em apresentar essa conferência aqui pela 40ª Semana do Tradutor e terceiro CIT. Eu quero dar as boas-vindas a todos nesta conferência, intitulada Feminist Gender Aware Translation and Translation Studies, Evolving Toward the Transnational. So, good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to have you all here at the 40th Translators Week and the 3rd International Translation Symposium. And it gives me great pleasure to announce and introduce, in Portuguese, then in English, our first international speaker for the conference titled Feminist Gender Aware Translation and Translation Studies, Evolving Toward the Transnational. Bem, é de fato um prazer dar as boas-vindas a Luise Von Flotow em nosso evento. Luise Von Flotow é professora de Estudos da Tradução na Universidade de Ottawa, no Canadá, desde 1996. Seus principais interesses de pesquisa se concentraram em questões feministas e de gênero na tradução, tradução como diplomacia cultural e tradução audiovisual. As publicações incluem artigos e livros de sua autoria e edição nessas áreas. Seus livros incluem The Routledge Handbook on Translation, Feminism and Gender, Translating Women, Different Voices in New Horizons, entre muitos outros títulos. Ela também é tradutora literária, trabalhando principalmente do alemão e do francês para o inglês. Publicações recentes incluem Manicanetish, tradução de Manicanetish, de Naomi Fontaine, no Prelo e previsto para publicação em 2021, entre outros projetos de tradução. Uma tradução para o francês é Tout le monde parle de la pluie et du beau temps. Panu, a tradução francesa de Everybody talks about the weather and we don't. Okay. So it is with special excitement that I'm pleased to welcome and announce Luise Von Flotow to our gathering. Luise Von Flotow has taught translation studies at the University of Ottawa in Canada since 1996. Her main research interests have focused on feminism, feminist and gender issues in translation, translation as cultural diplomacy, and audiovisual translation. Publications include articles and books authored and edited in these areas. Her books include The Routledge Handbook on Translation, Feminism and Gender, Translating Women, Different Voices and New Horizons, among many other titles. She's also a literary translator, working mainly from German and French to English. Recent publications include Manicanetish, translation of Naomi Fontaine's Manicanetish, forthcoming 2021, among other translation projects. One translation into French is Tout le monde parle de la pluie et du beau temps, Panu, the French translation of Everybody talks about the weather, we don't. Please, guys, join me in welcoming Luise Von Flotow. Please, Luise.
Good. Thank you for that nice introduction. Very nice. I'm looking for my PowerPoint so that I can start on my presentation. And for those of you who may have attended the conference that was held in Guyana last week, this PowerPoint is going to look much the same. So I don't know whether you in Sao Paulo or you attending this conference and listening were also in Guyana at the university last week. It's when I do these kinds of webinars, I sometimes have to repeat myself from one week to the next. It's difficult to create new material. So you can, those who have heard me before or heard me last week can check and see if I'm still saying the same thing. Okay, so I'm going to, if you could enlarge the screen for me. I don't know if I can enlarge the screen. That would help. Here, there. Okay, now I can see. Okay, so the title, as you will see, if you go back to the first page, if you go back to the title page, okay, who's manipulating this PowerPoint? Could you go back? Yeah, there, thank you. The translation, the title has changed just slightly because I think it's more important, or it has become more important, to talk about how the feminist ideas that were very local in Canada in the 1970s and 1980s and had a local effect which blossomed and moved out to other parts of the world, and to follow how the local becomes or moves into the transnational. So that's what, and the difficulties of that. So that's what I'm going to talk about. What was the local? How did it develop? And how did it move into more international areas? And what is the situation now with regard to this notion of transnational that we are all playing with? So yes, we can start on the first slide, please. Yeah, so here's the plan for the outline for this presentation. First of all, a few definitions. Secondly, the early years of local feminist translation, and local meaning in Canada, which is really where this notion began. Thirdly, how its expansion to work on ancient texts, retranslations, translation studies. Finally, the arrival of gender in the mid-1990s, and especially genders, plural. And then finally, from the 2010s onward, this development towards transnational feminist approaches to translation and to translation studies. So next slide, please. All right, a few definitions. And I always include these because I think it's important. People do not make the difference sometimes. Feminist translation refers to those activities that translators, editors, publishers carry out and enact on texts. So any interventions in the text, translations of feminist material by translators who are interested in feminist content or gender-aware content, and often carried out in the name of feminist politics, feminist culture, change in feminist directions. So that is what is referred to as feminist translation. Then we have the more academic material or academic activities, feminist translation studies, where the perspectives and the methods used by scholars, by journalists sometimes, by other academics and so on, who study and write about translation from a feminist point of view or in regard to feminist interests. So when I publish a book that is called Translating Women, I'm doing so from a feminist perspective, pulling together articles that look at women writers, women translators, the role of, or what happens to women characters when they're translated, and so on. So that would be an example of feminist translation studies. There's a difference. Just because you're a feminist translation studies scholar does not mean that you do radical feminist translation. I don't, for instance. There are not many opportunities. And so there's really a difference between those two activities. Now, the focus on feminism in translation and in translation studies really means a focus on women writers, women translators, texts relating to women. And there's a famous example about women's health, women's reproductive health that I'll talk about later, legal situations applying to women, specifically governmental treatment, NGOs that translate material that has to do with women's rights and so on. And last, but not least, the notion that translation is a feminine or female activity, secondary, because it is reproductive. And this idea has been around translation for centuries, and was identified and studied by someone called Laurie Chamberlain, who wrote a super article on this topic, demonstrating how translation is always coded as something that's feminine, less important than authorship, secondary, and reproductive, therefore feminine. Of course, those ideas have changed in our field today in translation studies in North America and the Eurozone somewhat, but they are still very, very prevalent in common parlance. So next slide. A few useful definitions here. From Bell Hooks, a definition of feminism, for those of you who wonder. Feminism, basically, she says, is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. So oppression on the basis of sex, exploitation on the basis of sexual difference. It also applies to various gender identities, gender queer, gender fluid, LGBTQI plus people, and other gendered identities. So basically you could say feminism is a movement that seeks to identify and alleviate oppressions, injustices, biases, stereotypes that are based on sex, sexual expression, on gender, and so on. So that's, it's highly political, obviously. And I'll go on with that. Okay, next slide. So gender. Gender, first and foremost, in its development as a word referring to sex and feminism and so on, came in the 1960s, 1970s, English American terminology that differentiated biological sex with sociocultural aspects of sexual difference. Well, gender was the term used very broadly for all of the educational, cultural aspects that come with being either a male biologically or a female biologically. And this idea of gender, singular, was expanded and is very much in the air right now, expanded to genders, plural, and you see I've put an S here on gender to point that out or to emphasize it. When the work was done by Teresa de Lauretis, Judith Butler, other people who themselves were non-binary or are non-binary, queer people, queer scholars, and the push really came in the 1990s to address and criticize what they called the binarism of traditional feminist paradigms. So binarism meaning only these two items, male, female, nothing in between. Meanwhile, genders implies everything, all of the identities and activities and behaviors and so on in between male, female on the extremes. So next slide, please. So gender and queer, especially when applied to text, which is what we do in translation, is associated with the fluid expression of sexuality, with the performative aspects of sexual identity, and with various options available for doing gender. So there's nothing of these hard lines of female and male, feminine and masculine, impinging on this broad spectrum of gender fluidity. So that, the focus therefore is on fluidity, on changeability, and very important for someone like Judith Butler, on the dignity and validity of any form of gender expression. So this comes into texts, and I'll talk about it in a moment, okay? All right, next one. So when we read for translation, when we read in order to translate, we read in a gender-aware manner, we look out for the discursive aspects of gender, how language, discourse, determines gender options. And this is something, and gender definitions, and the expression of gender. So this is something that Butler wrote about and various other people. For instance, one really typical simple example is, does the masculine form of a word include the female population that uses that language? And this has been argued back and forth, and is argued in the Académie Française, and is argued in Spain in the Real Academia. In German right now, big discussions about whether or not the masculine form of a word includes the females of the population, and let alone the gender, the other genders. And that is just a very simple example of how gender is in language and needs to be recognized that it is in language and imposes a certain structure and a certain way of thinking through language. So the other question that a gender-aware reader, translator would have to watch out for is different gender identities and how they are expressed in language. And this is something that Keith Harvey, 1999, wrote about. He's the first to have written about this topic. How is language used differently by different genders? When we have those plural genders, there are groupings of people who identify in different gendered ways and who use language in order to form that group and to be part of that group and use a certain slang. He calls it camp language. So how does the camp language, or the specific slang or dialect, if you want to call it, that's used by, say, gay groups or a particular gay group, visible in a text? And how does that translate into another culture, into another language? Okay, next one. There are also these performative aspects of gender that translators and people who read for translation need to be aware of in audiovisual work, for instance, in theater, in media, in technologies, in the digital technologies. Irene Ranzato has written about that in this handbook that I put together that came out in 2020. In Brazil, there's Sarah Lewis, who wrote about it early on in 2006. She published an article that has to do with how a Hollywood movie that presents various different gender options in the characters is dubbed, I believe, into Portuguese, and all of those differences disappear because the dubbers, who knows, the dubbers don't recognize them, the dubbers don't want to recognize them, the dubbing translators don't have the language available that the American Hollywood script provides. In any case, many people are writing on this topic right now, Pettini and Monti as well, in 2020 in the Handbook on Translation, Feminism and Gender. And the idea is that genders, those other groupings, use language differently, and that needs to be recognized and needs to be addressed and observed and dealt with in translation. Besides body language, the performance of different genders, which also requires sometimes explanation. An American Hollywood version of gayness may not translate really easily into China or into Iran, and needs further enhancement or further translation in the subtitles. Whether we get it or not is another question, but it would need further explanation. Okay, and the final thing that has come up recently is this difference of post-colonial transnational politics on the one hand, and differences in gender on the other, where the post-colonial, so the influence from the West, if you want to call it that, the influence from Anglo-America and Europe on other cultures, and in particular here we're talking about Indian Hijira culture, which is gay culture, and the influence of Anglo-American gayness on the language, on the behavior, on the options, and even on the caste system in India, and how that has moved through translation. It's super interesting and complicated. So there's that north-south or west to east problematics that also comes into discussions about gender and translation, and also feminism and translation. Specifically here, one little example at the bottom of the screen that I experienced, where I was in Iran, in Tehran, at a university, speaking about feminist Bible translations, which started in the 1970s and became this one very good one that was published in 1992. And one student at the back of the class, a woman, asked me, what does that have to do with us? Because us in Iran don't use the Bible, or don't use the Bible very much, and the Bible is not a basic text of that culture. So who cares in Iran whether there are feminist translations or not? More interesting would have been a talk for them on Quran translations. They weren't being done at the time by feminist retranslators, but they're being done now. So, but it's an indication of how this post-colonial influence from West and North into other cultures sometimes just doesn't work. They don't care. Why should they care about feminist Bible translation? So that's another interesting topic or interesting problematic that arises around gender and reading for gender-aware translation. Okay, next slide. So where does all this stuff come from? Where do the questions of feminist translation and gender and translation come from? That's what I'm going to briefly describe here. If you go to the next slide, please. Basically, it comes from bilingual Canada in the 1970s. Canada, as you know, has been officially bilingual only since 1968. But it has been bilingual for a long time, and actually multilingual, because we are a country of many, many immigrants. But in any case, officially it is French and English. And in Quebec in the 1960s and 70s, there was a strong revamping of culture, anti-Catholic, anti-English, anti-authoritarian, and numerous writers and women writers participated, women writers particularly, focused on feminist ideas and feminist work, and having their work translated by English women writers and translators for Canada. So very local, beginning in Quebec and then translated into English in Canada. Okay, if we go on, please, next slide. So the idea of feminist translation, and even the terminology feminist translation, came out of this work of experimental writing by a small group of very politicized French-speaking women in Quebec, who wrote over the course of the so-called Quiet Revolution, and published magazines and journals and so on that all had to do with language, and with language for women, and with situations of sexism and so on that women were experiencing, and with the concern for creating a literary language for women writers to use. So that was the scene in 1970s Quebec. Next slide, please. Influence from France. And if we look at this one citation, it's from a text by Luise Irigaray, Ce sexe qui n'en est pas un, published 1977, so right there in that time. And it argues for the need to change the conventional forms of the language and to broaden language to express women's lives, women's experiences. So she wrote, and this is my translation, the second paragraph: if we continue to speak the same language, we will reproduce the same history or story, même histoire, begin the same stories over again. If we continue to speak the same, if we continue to talk the way men have been talking for centuries, the way they taught us to talk, we will miss each other. That's a kind of poor translation of we will not be able to communicate with each other. Nous nous manquerons in the French. So the idea is that language has been so taken over by one side of this gender binary system, but the male side, dictionaries, books, the history of the language, the grammar books, and the publishers and publishing houses, everything is run by one particular group. And the language has been dominated and has to the exclusion of women. Okay, next slide. This 1970s. Yeah, so in Quebec, for instance, a couple of small examples. One of the focuses of these women writers was on language and grammar, and how language, masculine forms of the language, are favored, are more important, are imposed, and thereby discriminate against women, against the feminine in society. So Lucie Bersianic, one of the writers, wrote as an example this satiric little phrase, which I often cite. As an example, she shows 10 femmes et un cochon sont descendus la rue. 10 women and 1 pig, masculine, walked down the street or went down the street. The 1 pig among the 10 women causes the past participle to be masculine. So she says, there's something wrong here with this language and the way it works. Another person who was very influential in this particular movement was Nicole Brossard. She would write things like, she played a lot with language, but she also wrote things like this: Je suis un adjectif, commenting on the fact or referring to the fact that women are often simply described. Are they beautiful? Are they tall? Are they slim? Are they short? Are they ugly? Are they pink or green or whatever? And so that are reduced to descriptive words, as though there were no intellect and no brain. So je suis un adjectif, comme femme, je suis un adjectif. Or she would insist on écrire l'inédit, writing what has never been written before. So, and this was very strong, to come up with language to write experience and lives and so on that had never been written about before in the kind of male tradition. Okay, next slide. So to summarize, there is distress with the normal conventional language, which renders women invisible. The language always dominates, the masculine always dominates, which demeans women. If you consider in English the difference between wizard and witch, for instance, you can see how wizard is someone who carries out wonderful magical tricks, and a witch is someone that gets burnt at the stake and is ugly and has hairs on her chin and a wart on her nose and so on. The language systematically works against women and is hostile to women. That was one of the ideas of the 1970s. I don't think it has completely disappeared yet. And women authors need to be sensitive to these aspects of language and work against them. In other words, write against them. And this is political work. It interferes with the institutions, the school system, the education system, the dictionaries, the grammar books, and the power systems that are held in place by language. If you think of just the example, chairman, the chairman of a board automatically was no longer in Canada chairman. Now it's chairperson or simply the chair, sometimes chairwoman to when it's specific. And it's political work because it also, this kind of attitude toward language also undermines the language with which power systems are held in place. If you take away the chairman and put just the chair, the man and the influence of that particular gender at least disappears a little bit or is undermined a little bit, which is political. Okay, next slide. So not only in Quebec did women write about this kind of thing, but in English as well. Mary Daly, Marge Piercy, Ursula Le Guin, Margaret Atwood in Canada, very strong in that regard. Some of you may be aware of her text, The Handmaid's Tale, which was written in the 1980s, 1985, an amazing book on a conservative, authoritarian revolution which turns women into basically slaves of various sorts, and which was just in the Trump years turned into a television series, very successful television series in the US. In German, we have Verena Stephan and Luise Pusch. In French, various others, Hélène Sixou, France Théoret, Nicole Brossard. And in Norwegian, a wonderful writer by the name of Gert Brantenberg, who wrote a book called Egalia's Daughters, where everything is switched around. Women are the ones in charge of the society. Women, and the language displays that and is incredibly hard to translate. I've just published an article on those translations into English, together with two other researchers, and we really struggled trying to explain what's going on in these texts. So and in Portuguese, I'm not so sure. I'm sure you know people or women who wrote in that vein in Portuguese. So one of the research questions that a feminist translation scholar might ask is, who translated these texts? How were they translated? Who published them? Who translated Mary Daly into Portuguese? Who translated Margaret Atwood into Portuguese? Was she translated? Who published it? How was it published? How did the translation turn out? How did the translation deal with the experimental language? Is it a feminist translation, or is it a translation that hides and undermines the feminist aspects of the text? So, nice work to do. Okay, next slide, please. So what's interesting in Canada is that the few translators who were working into English with this material from Quebec did not only do translations, but they added to the translations. They became very visible and noisy, wrote essays. Here's the one very well-known name, Barbara Goddard, who translated various people here, Brossard, France Théoret, and so on. But she played the role. She's the one who put the term feminist translation on the map. She wrote essays, she wrote articles, she wrote the forewords to her translations, she wrote long footnotes explaining what she's doing. She did conference papers that never ended. She founded journals and wrote about the work of women on language, the work that women need to do, especially university academic women who form the kind of point, the vanguard of this kind of work. And she devised the term woman handling the text as a translator in this article that was published in 1989. And she talked about and wrote about flaunting her work on the text. In other words, she, as a translator, is not a quiet little mouse who says, I just translate what the text says. No, she flaunts her work. She explains what she does. She explains where the texts come from and what the texts are trying to do, etc. It's a very strong academic aspect of feminist translation. Okay, next slide. This is another person, Suzanne de Lotbinière-Harwood, still working and writing in Quebec, who translated various authors from this movement in Quebec, who also read her work at public events in Montreal, wrote essays about translating feminist language, and one about the pain of translating misogynist texts by men, and how she refuses to translate that stuff anymore, even though she's a working translator who needs to earn a living. She published this one book, 1991, Rebelle et infidèle, la traduction comme pratique de réécriture au féminin, which is a really emotional, personal account of her work. It's not an academic treatise, but it's very interesting and detailed, and as I said, emotional, passionate about her work with language and for women's language and the politics of it. Okay, next one. So some of the strategies that come with feminist translation, and which now also apply to other gender identities and translation, macro strategies would be selection of text to translate. Who do you translate? Who do you refuse to translate? So you refuse to translate texts that are hostile to women or that you see as hostile to women or women's rights. You focus on women writers, to translate. You focus on retranslating important texts. And that's important text, meaning key texts that are important to either the feminist ideas, feminist politics, or that are important to the culture in general. And there would be the Bible, translating, re-understanding biblical texts. And there's a famous, wonderful example. There's a woman by the name of Corsack, Mary Phil Corsack, who has retranslated the Genesis, the creation story, or especially in Genesis 2, the creation story, where she points out that Adam, the first man, presumably created by God, if you wish to believe that story, is in fact in the ancient Hebrew an Adam, like a table or a chair or a piece of wood, not a gentleman by the name of Adam with a capital A. And the word the Adam comes from the Adamah. The Adamah is the ground, the soil, the dirt, from which the Adam was created into a little figure. At least that's the story. And then the first human was actually the woman who was created out of the part, a piece of the side of the Adam was taken out, and then the first human person was created, which is a woman named Hava, not Eva, and Hava is life in Hebrew. So we have a completely rewrite, re-understanding, rereading of the story of Genesis through retranslation and feminists and other ways of understanding the ancient text, which has been translated and made worse and worse and worse as it goes along. They say, I don't know. I can only report what other scholars and people who know Hebrew and those ancient languages have observed. So, macro strategies. Now, if you do the next slide, please. There are practical micro strategies where the translator intervenes in the text where it's necessary. For instance, by not writing, the student must put his books on the table, but the student must put their books on the table, or his/hers books on the table, etc. There, just a small intervention. In Canada, it's quite normal these days to say the student must look out for themselves, or must pay for them, plural, self, singular, so that you get the pluralization idea that there are male and female and otherly gendered students, and self remains singular. It's very disruptive English, but yeah, innovative. And not that innovative if you look up the history of the word self. So the translator also marks their interventions by adding footnotes and comments and writing scholarly introductions or articles about their work. You don't just hide behind the text and say, oh, I'm just a translator. You draw attention to your work. And as in Barbara Goddard's work, you woman handle the text, including footnotes, comments, explanations, etc., to demonstrate not only that this is a text that has been worked on and worked through with a specific approach, but also that the translator has power over the text and has always had power over the text, even though they've hidden and snuck away and been behind the scenes. Okay, next slide. So if we think about this aspect of Canadian feminism in translation in terms of Bourdieu, and I just raised Bourdieu briefly here because Bourdieu has become such an important figure in translation studies. You could say that feminist translators developed a field of feminist work in translation in Canada. It became internationally recognized. They gained visibility and cultural capital in the process, recognition, publication, public interest, and so on. They earned economic capital, research grants. I've benefited from at least 2, if not 3, research grants that had to do specifically with such topics, like feminism, translation, gender, and so on in Canada. Study grants, publishing funds, and they developed social capital, networks, international networks, connections, friendships, publishing combinations, etc. But one of the things that we can't forget is that they addressed Canadian topics Canadian situations, Canadian history, Canadian politics. In other words, local. And that's what I want to emphasize, is that this local application is in fact local and doesn't necessarily apply across the board to Brazil, for instance, or to China, or to Pakistan. Okay, next slide, please. So in the 1990s, late 1990s, 2 books came out, again, from Canada, and the only books on feminism and translation at the time. This one here by my colleague Sherry Simon, Gender and Translation, 96, and then a book that I published, Translation and Gender, 1997. Very close upon each other. This one published by Routledge, and this one published in the UK in Manchester by St. Jerome Press. Okay, so it very much a Canadian phenomenon. Let's go on to the next slide. Yoo-hoo. Yeah, there. So this work and this focus spread toward international academics, especially, as I said, with regard to work on revision and retranslation of old texts, among them the Bible. Korsak is the one that I talked about, who retranslated the Adam. The notion of translating women writers and not just male writers, men writers. Retranslations of Beauvoir. So there's a whole huge amount of work on rereading and re-understanding, and then also retranslating Simone de Beauvoir, because she appears as kind of the first feminist of the 20th century. And more recently, retranslating, understanding differently the Quran, which has been commented on and written on, and with various hadiths, they're called these explanations of what the Quran means by various clergy, and explanations that are often very conventional, very traditional, very misogynist. So all of this has been done and is being done, and is a move towards international feminist interest in translation. Then further broad interest in translating women's writing and adding all those text aspects that I talked about, prefaces, footnotes, afterwards, and so on. Numerous articles in English on feminism and translation, and feminist writers and their translation from Hildegard von Bingen in German to Spanish, and also Portuguese writers, and later very much in Spain. There was a whole knot of academics working on feminist approaches to translation, and therefore burgeoning, flowering feminist translation studies, which now at this point have redeveloped and are really coming up again. It's like a whole younger generation is interested in this approach to translation, and not only in Anglo-America and Europe, but all over the world, in China, in India, in South America. We've just seen a lot of interest develop. So yeah, it's burgeoning. All right, next slide, please. So the queer development and genders pluralized came in the 1990s, focusing on plurality of genders, gender as discursive and performative, as I tried to explain briefly before, and not only biological. Feminism came to be seen as an outdated binary gender idea. And I recently had an example of that. Argelia, my PhD student from Mexico, had to defend her thesis proposal, and her thesis has to do with feminism and translation in Mexico, and how it happened or did not happen, more importantly. And the examiners wanted to know, hey, why are you working on feminism? That's so outdated. Why aren't you talking about gender and queer gender fluid and so on? And she had to insist and say, no, I'm interested in feminism as a political movement. And I I refuse, and I am excluding. It's too much for me to handle also ideas about gender and queer. But the examiners were very insistent, as if feminism were something that's dépassé, gone, out of fashion, or no longer interesting. And that really went on and on and on until in the 2010s, the category of women was no longer admissible or usable in research and writing. So it was impossible at that time to write about women, write about Canadian women writers, for instance. There are too many other genders. We cannot write about women. That issue is still around, not as intense, but still there. Okay, next line. With regard to what happened with queer genders and so on in translation and translation studies, Keith Harvey is the first person who developed work on gay language, or the language of gay groups, on camp language, as he called it, and its translation from French to English, published 1998. So he's very early in this regard. And finally, a book, Intercultural Movements, American Gay and French Translation, which studies how the radical, very noisy and visible gay aspects of language produced by gay writers in English are subtle, become very subtle in French, are not as blatant, not as obvious, not as passionate in French. Why? He tries to explain why as well. So next slide. Yeah, so he wrote in 1999 to 2004, and now in the meantime, other bigger developments have happened in regard to gender queer translation studies. Here, a focus on queer writers in translation, just like feminist translation looks at women writers in translation, so 2011. Focus on homosexually identified texts in translation, texts that focus on queer life, gay life, homosexual life, and so on. There's a whole collection of texts for 2017. Translation studies that focus on queer translators and how they impact a text, 2017 also. And here, this idea, which I really like, the idea that translation itself is a queering activity, because it changes a text, because it is never fixed, because a translation can always be redone, a text can always be reread, rethought, recreated, changed. So focus on the variability of translation, the options that translators have, the flexibility of translation, which equals queer, because queer has to do with identities, which are variable, optional, flexible, and so on. So those ideas were developed around 2014 here by Sperlin and others. So there's been quite a lot of work on the idea that queer is also visible and important in translation studies. Okay, next slide, please. Still, by 2011, I decided that it's time to write about women again, and I put together this book, Translating Women. It consists of a series of articles, all having to do either with women writers, women translators of science, for instance, which we don't know much about, but which is an interesting topic. Women translators, for instance, of medical texts from in the Renaissance, women on reproductive health, on birthing, and so on. There's an enormous amount of work still to be done. How did medical information pass along, and so on? This came out in 2011, and a colleague in the US right away said, "Oh, it's so colonialist." I can't remember what exactly. So Eurocentric, because it's true. The articles all have to do either with Anglo-America or Europe. So this notion of transnational was nowhere near that text. except to say we're translating from Russian to English, or somebody translating from French to Portuguese or something like this, but not beyond the Anglo-American Eurozone. Still, it was about women, so that was my focus at the time. Next slide. And now we need to talk about this movement from the local, which is this Canadian, French, English basis of feminist translation, to the transnational, and consider that what I'm going to call just two challenges that are important and that have come up and that constantly come up: cultural issues, which you can imagine, and then academic language, especially with regard to translation studies, transnational translation studies. Okay, next slide. What time is it? I'm not sure. Okay. So the question that we can ask is, how transnational is translation, especially from feminist and gender-aware perspectives? One would think that translation is by definition transnational. It crosses national boundaries, cultural boundaries, language boundaries. With regard to, in the field of translation and translation studies, questions of sex, gender, feminism, queer, homosexuality, and so on are very cultural, very political, very complicated, and very sensitive. And so they do not translate easily. The next topic, translation studies, where this question of transnational translation studies is somewhat inhibited by the fact that everything happens in English. All academic publishing is dominated by English, is produced in English, circulated in English. And this is a situation that was made much worse by the development of the internet over the course of the 1990s, and is now like solidly anchored in academic publishing. So those are two issues that affect gender, feminist ideas in translation and translation studies today, especially when we want to move from the local to the transnational. All right, next slide. And one excellent example with which one can show this is the translation history of this particular book, Our Bodies, Ourselves, published by the Boston Women's Collective in 1972, and then with ongoing editions afterwards. Basically a text on women's reproductive health, produced by a group of women who are feminists, who are working in 1970s against the medical establishment, which is very much masculine, and which sees women's bodies basically as unhealthy, requiring treatment all the time. So, set in the USA, and this book discusses all kinds of biological, physical aspects of women's reproductive health, including abortion, including many other topics which are sensitive, not only in the US, now, again, today, very much, but in many other cultures. And this book was translated, sort of, and adapted into 37 other languages. There are other translations coming out, and I believe there's one that is just, or about to, or has just come out in Brazil. And it has been subject to enormous censorship, huge changes, huge examples of rewritings. And it's a really interesting example of how transnational feminism has to be relative, has to be or is relative. It's as if women's bodies in Brazil, say, were completely different to women's bodies in Canada or in China, because the text has to be different to allow for culture, to allow for religious aspects or that have to do with male and female differences and so on. So if you give me the next slide. This one book has been published on Our Bodies, Ourselves in translation. It was published in 2007 by Kathy Davis, and starts to work on this question of how feminist ideas cannot translate directly or must be adapted to work or to apply in other cultures. Very, very excellent book. Okay, next one. The most recent book that deals with this subject is this one, written by, or co-written by, one of my PhD students. It's a translation from English into French for Quebec of 4 books, 4 chapters of Our Bodies, Ourselves, called Corps à Corps, Guide de Sexualité Positive. And it tries to use intersection, or to take care of, or keep in mind questions of intersectionality in translations. So intersectionality has to do with all of the different problems that people can encounter, being not only women or lesbians or homosexuals or otherly gender identified or men, but also Black women, racialized women, Indigenous women, handicapped women, handicapped men, trans women who are racialized, etc., etc. So all of the different ways that we can suffer our identities. And so to translate this particular book, Our Bodies, Ourselves, into Quebec French meant dealing with different groups, Indigenous women, handicapped women, to say, how does this translation, how does this language suit you? Can you identify with this way of describing sexual activities and so on? Yeah, and it was very complicated and ended up with getting rid of the words he or she, using neutral terms such as person or partner. Interesting thing being that person becomes la personne, feminine in French, and partner becomes le partenaire. So you can have a comment about, or a description or discussion of 2 women having sexual relations and how that works and whatever they write about, and only le partenaire, masculine, being discussed, or being the term used in the text, where in order to keep it as neutral as possible. A really difficult exercise, but very good material for a PhD dissertation, and interesting to read. So this is the most recent attempt that I know of to translate between English, French, German in my languages. All right, next slide, please. So the English aspect, I said there's cultural aspects that really cause problems. The English aspect is another one, especially in translation studies, which have been so dominated by Anglo-American and European discourse, promoted in English and English and English, even though there's comparatively little translation into English. All other cultures translate from English into Swedish, into Danish, into Portuguese, and so on. But English does not necessarily translate from Swedish, from Portuguese into English. However, English dominates the academic publishing world, which means it imposes English ideas, English essay writing styles, English thinking and thought structures and ways of developing an essay, which limits publication for non-English academics. They have to basically publish in a language which is their second language or their third language, and where they haven't necessarily learned to follow all these structures of how to write an essay. So very much inhibits transnational publication into academic language. Next slide, please. So some work has been done in translation studies to try to reach out to academics working in translation studies, to get them also to think about feminist and gender-aware ideas and apply them to translation studies. And this book is one that I did with Farzaneh Farhazad. You can see I reached as far abroad as I could to find a co-publisher, a co-editor in Iran. And we brought together a whole bunch of articles on feminist aspects of translation and gender issues in translation from Mexico, from China, from Morocco, from Turkey, Sri Lanka, and so on, to try to create a book where other cultures could apply, think about, develop feminist ideas in translation, and translation studies primarily. Okay, next slide. So if we take transnational attitudes and try and explain what they are and what they do in translation studies and feminist translation studies, basically it has to do, I think, with recognizing the effects of local and colonialist aspects of translation and translation studies and mitigating those impacts. So changing them, affecting them, undermining the power that was in, or has been in transferring these local ideas from Canada to elsewhere as if they applied everywhere. So this means expanding or ignoring borders. And I'm sure you know the work of Claudia de Lima Costa, she's in Florianopolis. Sonia, I think, Alvarez, who've written on this topic already. It means bringing new discourses into academia. And this is a really interesting one that I came across doing that book, the idea of Islamic feminism and the retranslation, reinterpretation of the Quran. It means raising questions at transnational levels and in regard to post-colonialism and neo-colonialism. For instance, this idea of gender mainstreaming. What is that? It's a term that developed by the United Nations in the 1990s, applied across the board in international development and international aid. But what is it? How do you translate gender mainstreaming into Urdu? And what does it mean on the ground? Very problematic. How do you translate it into Kuwait? Something that I'm working on right now with a Kuwaiti Arab speaker. So very complicated. It has to do, so transnational in translation has to do with incorporating the other, listening to the other, publishing, reading, and understanding the other, whoever that other is, often from very far away. China, for instance, at the moment, we're working with something Chinese as well. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so other transnational work has come out, and I want to draw or mention this book, Feminist Translation Studies, came out in 2017, put together by Olga Castro, who's Galician from Spain, works in England, and Emek Ergun, Turkish, works in the US. Again, the English focus is interesting, from a Spaniard and from a Turk. Then Mutatis Mutandis, for those of you who don't know, it's a journal, the only journal for translation studies in South America, comes from Colombia, Antioquia, and recently published 2 special issues that have to do with feminist transnational translation studies. And the one that I was involved in also published at least 1, if not 2 articles that came from Brazil in Portuguese, and with good, solid English language abstract, but still the article itself in Portuguese. And that's the idea, to expand opportunities for academics to publish in their own languages. All right, next slide. Oh yeah, this is the most recent book that the introduction mentioned, that Melissa mentioned, that I put together with Hala Kamal. Here she is, Hala Kamal, professor at Cairo University. And it is a book that it consists of 41 articles, all dealing with some aspect of feminism or gender-aware reading and writing in translation. 36 of those articles were written by non-English speakers or people who don't have English as their first language. Took an enormous amount of editing, enormous amount of patience, an enormous amount of work, and brought out all kinds of material that had not been published and not been available in our so-called lingua franca before in English. Yeah. So that came out July 2020, just at the beginning of this dreadful pandemic that we're still suffering. Okay, next slide. Yeah, and one of the big challenges, like I said, that we meet and that we met also in this particular book was the need for cultural translation. When you move feminism from one place to another, you need to explain much more of what's going on. So Garima Sharma, for instance, in the 2020 book, writes about the translation of A Room of One's Own by Wolf into Hindi. And she comments on the Hindi translations and how they miss the point and how they don't pay attention to all kinds of feminist aspects in Virginia Woolf's text, but also on the cover of the Hindi book, which she says the covers do not depict a room of one's own that an Indian woman could relate to, a room that Indian women, especially in the rural areas or in large and joint families, might dream of having. So not only does the text miss the feminist points of Virginia Woolf's article, but even the cover of the book doesn't get it. And so there are many, many aspects, the argument being there are many aspects to transnational feminist enterprises that need to be taken into account and that need to be looked at and thought about. Interestingly, from South America, there's an article that came from Chile. Rosa Basaure and others, 3 or 4 other women co-wrote it, and it argues for the argument is around how the nana in South American writing is translatable into English. Say, the problem being that the nana, the live-in indigenous babysitter and child caregiver, doesn't exist in English, or doesn't exist in English language cultures, or hardly, or may have existed in the 19th century, but certainly not now. And so to understand the role of the nana in these books that come from Latin America, that come from South America, and that come from the Cono Sur, would mean in translation, writing explanatory footnotes, writing explaining that in the text itself, in the translation itself, how important this character is. And where the translations, these academics argue, need to depict the economic, ethnic, and gender inequalities of the nana. A South American writer who reads this material in Spanish would know that. The English reader doesn't know that, needs further explanation. Okay, next slide, and I'm going to disappear for just a sec because I have to plug in my computer, otherwise it's going to go dead. 2 minutes, or not even 2 minutes. And I'm almost done. Okay. So basically, the challenges facing transnational feminist translation studies include this issue of listening to the others, understanding what's there and what needs to be translated differently and enhanced, and accommodating others, and that also applies to academic publication, which, because it remains anchored in English, requires enormous amounts of editing and reworking and revising in order for it to be publishable in English. Okay, I think we're almost on the last slide. One more slide. Yeah, you can skip over that one. That's too hard. Next slide. All right, so this is the last slide, and I referred to an article written by Hala Kamal, who is my co-editor in the handbook, in that big book we published in 2020. She has translated feminist theory, feminist materials into Arabic. She lives and works in Egypt, and 2018 she published an article on the difficulties of translating feminist material from the West. In other words, it could be labeled neo-colonialist, into Arabic. And she claims that, and she states that, translating such material requires, first of all, and for the translator to have a deep understanding of the terminology and the theory that they are working with and that they are translating. Often this is not the case, And in the 2020 handbook, we have a couple of articles about how feminist material was translated into Eastern Europe and into Russia after the fall of the Berlin Wall and after the collapse of the communist systems in East Central Europe, and how poorly the material was translated. A load of money came to try to allow this kind of translation, promote this translation, but people didn't know what they were translating. And the word, for instance, the word empowerment, which is a very feminist word, was developed in over decades in English, didn't have a Russian version. No Russian word for that. The word agency, no word, no understanding even of what it means. And so Hala would argue the translator needs to understand this stuff in order to translate it. Secondly, the translator needs to understand that the translation process, not only the translator, but the publisher as well, requires interpretation. You understand what it means in the first language, but you interpret it for the new language. You mediate, you transform, you adapt, like the examples of all those texts about women's reproductive health that have been adapted to allow them to be published in another place. Thirdly, you, the translator and the publisher, reflect on the ethical implications of translating feminist texts. What does it mean ethically and more widely politically to translate this material into the new language? And how do you address those issues that might be raised? And then finally, an awareness of the prospective readership is required. Who are we translating for? How do we translate to address that readership and to make material available and accessible to that readership? All of that comes into this question of moving the local aspects of feminist translation from 30 or 40 years ago to contemporary situations in other parts of the world that are just opening up to this material. Right. I think that's the end of my presentation. And I'm happy to answer any questions if you have, or take comments. Voila.
Okay. All thanks to your enlightening words that inspired us all here. And well, we've got a couple of questions for sure. And I like to say that translation is that flexible. It's never fixed, as you said. Yeah. Crossing language boundaries and cultures. And it is definitely interesting to notice how transnational feminism is relative, definite, clear. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
And we have a couple of questions, as I said, from the audience. So please, girls. Okay. This is a question from our professor, Claudia Zavalha. And she says that in a Portuguese to Italian translation, I have translated lawyer as avocata, and it is better today than avocatrice. Sorry about my Italian. Because the form exists and presupposes the feminization of professions in the language. I think it continues, please, girls. Well, anyway, I have the continuity here. However, I was forced to change my translation to avocado, as the client argued that in Italy there is no such thing as avocata. Then she continues that she made the change with a lot of pain in her heart, arguing that this was not correct. And then she asks, how can we not submit to these in our translations? What's your piece of advice, maybe?
It is so difficult. But I think if you are working for a living as a translator, you have to satisfy the client. Otherwise, you lose your client. That's one thing. The other thing is, though, that to talk about these things, to write about them, to publish about them, to explain what's going on and what needs to change is an important aspect of translation, and is an important aspect of what we do when we write and talk about feminist translation and the feminist adaptation of languages and so on. I mean, the Italian client, is probably not a linguist, is probably not aware of some of the work that has been done in regard to women and language and feminism and language, and so is maybe a hopeless case. But it doesn't mean that you give up. It means that you just keep producing and keep writing and keep working at it and keep pointing out where change is required. And eventually it comes. It's coming in France right now. It's coming in German right now. I don't know exactly what's happening in Italy, but in German, for instance, they have a huge dictionary called the Duden. And it is like the Oxford English Dictionary, but it's the Duden, and it's for German. And this winter, I believe, they published a new version of the Duden, which includes a separate entry for every feminine form of a noun. For instance, citizen, Bürger, masculine, Bürgerin, feminine. Separate entry in the dictionary, which makes the dictionary very fat. And people would say, oh, what a waste of paper. Oh, what a waste of time. Oh, how terrible. And there were huge outcries over this, and journalists and articles and political commentaries on it. But at least it's happened. And it has occurred and has been recognized that there can be two different types of citizen, one masculine, one feminine. And not only citizen, but also doctor and also avocat. Rechtsanwalt in German. I don't know. I haven't checked whether the German has masculine for Rechtsanwalt, lawyer, and Rechtsanwältin, feminine for, I don't know, but maybe they have if they did for citizen. So persevere is all I can say. And educate your clients.
True. I'll tell her. That's it.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have another question. Well, I believe it's a comment. A feminist approach to translation has been in the spotlight in Brazil, especially in the last few years. I guess it continues. Do you see this more as an effect of resistance to the current Brazilian political context, since this government has strong sexist views, among other issues?
Maybe.
Well, and it continues as a more a branch of feminism as product trend.
Feminism as product.
As a product.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what's happening in Brazil, but what I've noticed is that there's a huge increase in interest in feminist translation, not only in Brazil, but also in Latin America more broadly, in Chile, in Argentina, in Colombia, and in other parts of the world, like China, for instance, like Egypt, like Middle Eastern countries. It's like the younger generation of scholars has rediscovered something that started 50 years ago, say. And whether that is a reaction to Monsieur Bolsonaro or not in Brazil, I don't know. And feminism as product, I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure that there is such a thing as feminism as product, but I'd be happy to talk to Fernanda about that, who I believe wants to come to University of Ottawa next year. I don't know. Yeah, I recognize her name. Hello, Fernanda.
Yeah. And we have a former student of ours that she was for her master's with you. That's Marina Zorzeto.
Oh, yeah.
And, yes, and Marina was our student.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe Fernanda. Okay, so another question. This is a question Julia asks. Luise, do you think that the feminist translation as a translation practice based on feminism, I guess, and theories could be a counterpower to the mass media, which still perpetuates a male point of view?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it could, but it's the mass media is so powerful that the little feminist interventions are small. But again, it's a question of persevering and pointing out, and I think that there's a lot of work in Spanish and in Italian that has been done on mass media and gender questions, and translation of mass media material into Italian, mass media material into Spanish, mass media material produced in English. So I don't know whether in Portuguese, and I imagine it's much the same, that the mass media material is horribly misogynist and can, yeah. All I can say is persevere, write essays, write articles, draw people's attention to how disgusting some of this stuff is. And it's not funny. And a lot of women participate in it. So it's difficult also because, we're all subject to our clients, and the clients are not necessarily supportive of women.
Not always.
No, not always.
Yeah. Okay, so Fernanda asks again, considering that Canada is a multilingual country, what's the role played by translation in the media out there?
Good question.
She reformulates, I'm so sorry, Luise. In other words, do people from different linguistic, cultural backgrounds have access to the main media, radio, TV, via translation?
I would say probably no. That there are the official Canadian funded by the government radio and television, which is called CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, has a French part to it. But that developed only in the 1960s or 1970s. So it isn't very long ago that we have had English broadcasting and French broadcasting. So if you want to listen to the news in English, you listen to the news in English, and you watch TV in English, and you do stuff in English. If you want to listen to the French, you listen to the French. What's interesting is that people have studied how different the news are in English and the news are in French, because the news are, or the news programs are addressing different populations. And so what's news for one population is not necessarily news or of interest to the next population. And then also people have studied the translations of political texts, political speeches, not so much this Trudeau, because he doesn't hold very many interesting speeches, but his father, Pierre Trudeau, was translated into French in a certain way at a certain time, whereas his English speech was quite different from the French translation, and vice versa. When he spoke in French, his English translation was rather different because we're addressing a different public. And so I don't think that the other chains, radio and television chains, do a lot of translation, but what is translated, and that's interesting too, is music lyrics written by French Canadian writers, and music performed by French Canadian writers is translated into English, performed in English, because the government body regulates how much Canadian content is on the airwaves. And so we need to produce translations of things like pop songs in order to have Canadian content, enough Canadian content. Otherwise, Canada is flooded by material from the US. So the government says, okay, we need so much Canadian content. Okay, let's produce some Canadian content in English and French. And so there you have an interesting translation situation. Yeah. That's about what I know, but one would need to study that more clearly, more carefully.
Okay, yeah, right. So, okay. A gente vai ver com ela se ela disponibiliza. They're asking for the slides because of the references, and we can talk to you later about that.
Yeah.
It's
I'll
okay?
give them away. Yeah, no problem.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, another question. We're done. Let's wait. No. We're over? Nope. Okay. All right then. So,
Great.
please. Yeah, great. I cannot thank you enough for gracing our event.
For being interested. Yeah.
Yeah, it was invigorating. You know, it made everyone feel fulfilled, I'm sure. And I would like also to thank you on behalf of our colleagues and our students who are thrilled to have you with us today and just exchange a few words with you. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts for being with us. We're so grateful. And we do hope to have you here in Brazil in the near future.
Yes. I would love to come.
Yeah, you told me.
Especially in January or February, when it's horrible here.
Yeah, and here is hot and sunny, so you probably have a good time, and we do hope it happens. So thank you very much. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
See you. Bye.
Tchau.
Ok. Então, agora temos os sorteios. Obrigada a todos. Vocês vão transmitir, gente? Eu não tô vendo. Yeah. Ok, o sorteio de livros. Eu não tô enxergando. Oh my God. Vamos aguardar o sorteio, que eu não enxergo. É muito pequeno. Acho que ainda não sorteou, certo, gente? São 2 sorteios. Estamos aguardando, então. So here we go again. Acho que tá faltando a telinha do sorteio. Vamos aguardar. Aí, agora sim. São 67 pessoas. Acho que tem que colocar o 2, não é? Ok. Vamos sortear. Números 22 e 42. Vou procurar na lista. 22, Maria Cecília Lopes. E 42, né? Amanda Câmara. Parabéns, então, aos sorteados. As sorteadas, vocês podem entrar em contato, então, com a comissão, tá? E, gente, então eu encerro essa mesa, que foi realmente fascinante. Eu fiquei muito feliz de ter a Luiz com a gente. E segue a programação, então, à tarde, e a gente se vê. Obrigada, tchau. Bye!